Welcome back to Frontrunner Podcast. Today we've got John in and he's going to be talking about the use of blockchain, particularly around decentralized economies. Welcome to the podcast, John.
Thank you, James. I appreciate you having me on. It's a fantastic opportunity and it's definitely a subject I love talking about.
John, if we go back in time, way back before the Industrial Revolution, we can see very much a decentralized economy, one in which people use the resources at hand to be able to produce enough for themselves. And if they had more, then they would sell it to their neighbors, maybe in a barter approach. Along came the Industrial Revolution, which really centralized everything. So people had to go to a central facility, maybe a manufacturing environment. There was efficiencies there. There was economies of scale there. But now it seems that with the advent of modern technology, we're moving into where the centralized economy has built-in inefficiencies in it, which are now starting to become more readily apparent. For example, if we think of the hydro electrical generating industry, we lose some of that power through the transmission of electrical energy across the lines. And it would make more sense just from that inefficiency to be able to generate power and use it locally. So we generate it in the house and use it locally. The technology is now starting to play for decentralized economy. We also have issues around trusted sources. Traditionally, government and banks have been our trusted sources. They're the ones that take all our information, make sure that all the accounts are there and the economy is working. We have seen over the last few years failures in those trusted sources. And so both the potential for decentralized economy is being driven both by the need to rethink trusted sources, centralized trusted sources, as well as the inefficiencies that we're now starting to realize in a centralized economy. And this really starts to open up the possibility of decentralized economy. Could you maybe start us off with telling us what is the vision for a decentralized economy that you see out there?
Thanks, James. I like how you brought up the historical perspective too, and there's a little bit I would like to add to that. We kind of jumped over, right? We went from feudal systems that were essentially very decentralized authority and manufacturing to, we hit the Renaissance where, that start to centralization did really begin there, and our financial systems got upgraded during that time period too. So the lockstep is not just the manufacturing that happened, it was also the upgrading of the financial systems. We went from base metals to paper notes at that time period, and then we started getting, in the 1800s, we got the savings bank, which I used in my pitch before, but Henry Duncan really changed the world with that one. So at that same time, we had a decentralized financial system initially where people really held their own wealth, and then it started to become centralized because the efficiencies that you're talking about, centralization can be really efficient. We've now gotten to the point I would put out there that we have hit a scale issue with our centralization tools, and we are pushing back towards looking at decentralization as a ways to get around that. The example I usually give is in relation to the logistics aspect. So one of the big pain points and price is shipping, right? Moving materials all around and then getting it back to the location that you need it. Ideally, if we can get to a situation where manufacturing is decentralized, that let's say we get to the point where we have fabricators, where 3D printers are really simple, you dump raw materials on one end, you get your finished product at the other. In that scenario, you're starting to look at, well, is it better for me to, or is it more cost effective for me to order 1,000 widgets from one location, let's say in China, for a certain price point, or 1,000 widgets over multiple locations and have them all brought together in the location that I need? And I think that's one of the areas is kind of hitting that traveling salesman problem, right? Where blockchain can start really providing an efficiency and a move towards the decentralized economy, not necessarily by being the platform that does it, but getting into your second point, hitting that trust layer, right? So instead of having a system, and to mention some of the big ones, right? The LIBOR scandal was one of the hugest in that violation of trust. And we don't talk about it a lot, and there's a whole bunch of issues still that need to be addressed with it. But that trust layer, what I really like about blockchain, what really made me fall in love with it is that it takes away a lot of the ability, if implemented correctly, for bad actors to game the system. And by doing that, it gives us an opportunity, a space to start putting into systems that otherwise potentially would just fail because a bad actor could enter the network and just disrupt it and ruin it for everyone, and then everyone has that loss of trust and they don't want to use it anymore. So I see it in that area, and I also see it in being able to automate a lot of the supply chain so that people don't have to focus on the aspects that they're not good at. Small business owners don't necessarily want to be fantastic bookkeepers. It's not even why they got into it, to be a bookkeeper. They're not accountants, but you have to learn all those skill sets. Even any entrepreneur does, right? So ideally, if we can get into an area where, one, we have trusted actors that are providing oversight that everyone does trust and has proven their trust and have a transparent record for it, but also has an automated system where a lot of it's handled for you. My taxes being done for me would be fantastic, right? Every transaction that I do, real time, they're being updated, and I don't have to do anything for it at the end of the year. It's just done for me. That would be great. And then if there's a dispute resolution, that's where humans get involved. Go, oh, wait a second, I don't think this is correct, right? Let's negotiate on it and figure it out. So that's why I'm really, really positive on blockchain technology. Now, the reality, comes slamming in, the wall coming in, is that it's not really needed in North America right now. Like, there are areas where we can use it, and it's really niche areas. And I think that's where some of the really interesting development will come from, like that long-scale 10-year type 5-year projects. The area that I would really like to see the industry start going into is in the distressed markets, is in the markets that have a hyperinflation. Like, obviously, Venezuela is the big one, but there's areas in Africa and Asia, etc., where their economies, their basic financial network is not very robust, and we can start coming in and providing them a set of tools and mechanisms and a trusted network where they can start building value, and without ideally the concern of, is the political structure that's going on right now, or the political situations or the financial situations, how disconnected from it can I be at my very local decentralized level? Like, in my backyard, do I have to be directly connected to it, or can I put a buffer through so that I can still do value creation? I can still grow my potatoes, I can still grow my food, I can still sell them to my distributors, I can still buy inputs from the people I need to keep that value creation going, and hopefully smooth out the instability a bit, because there's this underlying, okay, well, if everything's going terrible here, I can now hedge and move over here, as long as the infrastructure and the knowledge base is there. So I think that's the big challenge. I went a little far afield there. Sorry, James, if you'd like to jump in.
John, the two elements that you described that we can get out of blockchain, which help with the decentralized economy, the trust and the transparency, in the supply chain environment, we can see great value for that, because one of the things that supply chain environments are wrestling with is counterfeit products or authentication of who's putting it in. For example, in any of the product environments that I've talked about, pharmaceutical, even grocery environments, they're always concerned with authentication of the products that are coming in. We know in the grocery industry that there's a real push to tracking, sourcing of products. So that's a big issue. And even in the cannabis industry, trying to weed out, so to speak, the bad actors and make sure that all the supply is coming from legitimate holders of licenses. But if we look in the financial area that you've talked about in let's say, emerging economies, one of the major issues there is the authentication of identification. If we have people in large parts of emerging economies, people do not have vetted identification, and therefore they do not have that easy ability to authenticate who they are and hold title to properties, because they can't validate who they are. If blockchain is going to be involved with decentralizing and potentially bringing up the authentication, the trust, and the transparency, it has to deal with how do we authenticate who people are, the properties that they hold. We cannot necessarily rely on government agencies in certain economies. Those agencies themselves might be either not have adequate record keeping or be corrupt. And how do we deal with that issue of knowing who is exactly putting money in or supplies in or assets into the blockchain?
That is definitely a difficult one to tackle down. I would lean towards that the products that start coming out will need to really lean into how people authenticate themselves in the real world. So in the situation that you're talking about, that person can be authenticated, but it has to be authenticated by the people that they interact with, and you need a larger trust network. So you get into that decentralized trust network aspect where people are cross-vetting each other. And then you have hopefully some transparency with their transactions where you can start pinning down and saying, okay, you are the person you say you are doing transactions in the area that you are, and you have a bunch of other people that are also trusted by other people saying you are who you are. So we're going to lean on that. Now on the property side, the actual ownership and property rights, that's a really local one as well too. One of the pain points of hitting into South Africa is that the subcultures within it have different concepts of property rights and how they work. So that's an interesting one, and I don't really have a solution for it. It's not one that I've done a lot of thinking on. Most of my value prop design around it is leaning on that the people will have proper documentation that I can capture and store and use for my own KYC and AML requirements, that know your client and anti-money laundering. That's not what I've really given a lot of thought into, thinking to, beyond how we can start recording these interactions. So the interaction between the individuals and their networks, and how we can leverage that to provide some transparency and validation that they are who they say they are. It's kind of how I guess Visa does it right now too, right? In the sense that we can detect your fraud based off your actions. We kind of know it's not you doing this over here.
Well, John, we might be able to do something like that with blockchain and the decentralized economy, as you talk about trust and transparency. If we have a blockchain-based economy, which is decentralized, and we have issues with authenticating people, perhaps that's where AI can come in and take a look at what the patterns of behavior. You already alluded to this with Visa and other examples, that maybe one of the ways to put trust into place is to have layers of users in the system, where the first level use is a non-trusted individual, and then looking at their patterns of behavior over time through perhaps an AI analytics, we can build that layer of trust onto them based on their past actions.
There's a great point on trust too you brought up, and it's an interesting one. Who trusts the AI? Right, in that situation, we have a centralized AI that the people that build that product are going to have a massive trust level with the people using it, so that if it's ever compromised and starts, let's say, deplatforming people, right, that the AI is then abused to say, oh, you're really not who you are anymore, with the ramifications from that. So it's an interesting question. Or then how do you get into doing decentralized AI? Because who watches the watchers on those ones? And that's kind of one of the things that I think blockchain is trying to tackle down, is how do we handle things like that can have a massive impact on our life. I don't know if you've ever read Isaac Asimov's I, Robot, but there is a short story in there that kind of tackles down that situation where the AI starts getting rid of people it doesn't like. And so I'm not a big one for AI in that way. I am in the efficiency of machine learning and using it to match patterns, but then there's the issue of who controls those centralized AIs, and what are the potential ramifications, and how do we audit them? And I think blockchain provides a very good audit trail, where you could have a centralized AI and then writing its audit trail to a blockchain, which can still be encrypted, right? And then you can give key access to the appropriate agencies and government bodies, et cetera, like that, where they can turn and take a look at stuff. Or you can turn as a customer and look at your own stuff. And I think that's where the melding of these two might be able to really meet in the middle and provide that trust layer for these services that people kind of don't trust. And I would argue that people don't really trust AI at this point, and I think rightly so. It's a very new technology, and if you can look at how bad it can go and how wrong it can go, it's one of the ones that I'm actually quite nervous about in the long run. But I'm also very hopeful for, because we have this other technology that provides that decentralized trust layer, which I think can give the auditing capability. But it's the tool that we want to use for identity verification, because it is really powerful and it works really well. And then you don't have to have necessarily all these ID pieces that can be lost or stolen or counterfeited, etc.
So, John, we've talked about using a decentralized approach for the financial industry and as well as the supply chain industry and some of the authentication issues around that. Where else could we use the decentralized approach? I'm thinking in terms of voting, for example. We could have individuals who maybe vote on community issues, or maybe government itself could become decentralized. Government has both the efficiency of bringing together the services, building roads, building hospitals, etc., which tends to be better if a community pools its resources rather than each individual try and pave their own portion of the road. Do you also see decentralized government working?
Potentially, because it has worked in the past, right? Like we have had like feudalism was decentralized. Now it was centralized in the local, lord or duke or whatever, etc. They had power in their own area, but the authority wasn't centralized into the king until much later on. So we have had it. I potentially, I think the real one on that one is how do you decentralize defense, right? Governments and decentralized infrastructure creation. We kind of do that already. We can think of crowdsourcing the other mechanisms, but defense is going to be the difficult one, and it kind of always has to be centralized authority on that one. I can see decentralization and blockchain powering, especially on the voting side, and the transparency for allocation of funds. Right? If I can see what my elected official is actually directly doing, like I can trace my dollar that was given to tax directly to where it was spent, and you can potentially do this with blockchain. I can get very granular and see, then I might make better and more informed choices, and also kind of hold my politicians' feet to the fire that way, in that you said you were going to do these things, but you didn't allocate resources to actually complete those. You allocated resources to something else, and it wasn't successful either. We got a very poor return on our investment. Now, that's great for the quantified stuff. That's stuff that we can actually track with metrics. Qualitative analysis is a bit different, but that's where we get to a dialogue and start maybe using it to quickly and easily organized a more inclusive voting and engagement system, right? Like polling right now and voting is very labor intensive, like to do the actual physical ballots. But then you really need those to validate who people are. So it goes back to that identity and trust layer. If we can nail that decentralized trust layer with it, then we can start doing these other things with it, where doing decentralized government where you don't necessarily have a city hall, a physical building. Your government is now a platform service, and you're connecting through it, and you're doing your interactions through this platform service, basically, that is now your city hall. And then you potentially have physical locations for town halls, and you can organize and use it as a communication channel. People can do a transaction, right, to cast their vote, or attend physically and cast votes that way, etc. So I do see potential with it. I think mainly, though, that it's like government will come last on this push, and it will be already somewhat of a done deal by the time we get there. I see the next big push, and where we want to focus in, is open source manufacturing, open source hardware. And the project that I was mentioning that I like to reference is Open Source Ecology and the Open Building Institute. And I highly recommend people check them out. They have been running for, I think, 12 or 13 years now. The goal of the project is to open source hardware manufacture. The 50 machines required to build a modern society, anyone can take them. You can fork the designs, you can build it, and they've been working at it. They have a tractor up and running, like 7 or 8 iterations of it now, and it's very comparable to commercial tractors. They have a micro house that they started, little 800 square foot, cost $10K to build, but they do swarm construction and parallel builds. So you kind of need this decentralized trust layer tracking everyone and how they're contributing, so you can pay them out properly as well. And you can use these really, really big crowds to put together housing. Like they can build a house in 7 days, and now it's like a 2,000 square foot house that you could modular design. They've iterated over. They have a sustainable egg farm now that as part of their designs. They have greenhouses. Like you can design it any way you want, and it's really, really cool. But the part that they're struggling with, the part that they hit a wall with, I would say about 6-7 years ago, was the supply chain and putting together a decentralized supply chain to power this. Because the idea being, like, the compressed brick layer, you use that on site, you build it and manufacture it on site, then you go where you're building and you use the dirt that you're digging out to build foundations, to build the bricks, etc. So you want to have a lot of people, and this is kind of interesting too, because Ruckify, which is an Ottawa startup here, is kind of stepping into that space of trying to get into the shared equipment, economy, and there's someone I can see potentially stepping in, and then their insurance side maybe will go blockchain to handle it, but then there is this potential with really having this explosion of economic development around, especially in rural areas where it's much cheaper cost of living as well, and people want to get back out of the city into these rural communities because, like I do, my son's autistic. It's much safer once we're done here in the glebe for the schooling and stuff. We'll want to move out to a small rural community where we can build something up, autism villages. And then using blockchain is the way that I'll have a trust network for it as well, in that I know who's a really good manufacturer. People are self-rating each other, and all these ratings are getting stuck into the blockchain where no one can go in and manipulate it later. So now I don't have to worry about if company Y is taking money to promote some people but not telling me that, and the people that I end up dealing with are not actually the best people for me to deal with, versus this other trust layer which is neutral to everyone. And I can really dig in and I can see who is the team I want to build to accomplish the goals that I'm looking for. So I really see the trust layers where we start, and then the financials go hand in hand with trust layer.
John, we're at the end of our podcast, and do you have a quick takeaway for our listeners?
For what I really recommend now too is just get your toe dipped in the water. Start with a hardware wallet. Like, you can start with software wallets, but if you want to be really safe with it, start with a hardware wallet. Start learning the technology. Buy a little bit of Bitcoin. Buy a little bit of Ethereum. Check out the development environment, especially if you're in any type of teaching environment or anything. Learn the technology a little bit first, and then encourage your students just to onboard and start digging into it. Like, you don't have to be computer scientists for this. It's everyone is accessible to it. I really recommend the sales and marketing guys to start using it too, and start thinking about how are companies going to use this to power their next round of innovation, and how can I start potentially coming up with value props for it. And that starts with use it. Just use it. Just even if you're putting a little bit aside and just forget about it, and every little while just play around with it. Try to find user groups or community events and start talking to them and getting involved. But mostly really just start using the technology. Just like we did with the internet. We didn't get Amazon and everything and Facebook to start. It started with people just using a little bit, making up really terrible web pages on Angel Fire, and now we have these amazing value props. So that's my takeaway for people: is the best way to get started with this is just dive into it. It can be really safe. Don't get sucked into the FOMO. Don't get sucked into the FUD, and just enjoy it and have fun with it, because it is amazing technology, and it will be here forever.
Great. Thank you, John. Thank you very much for the discussion today.
Thank you, James. I really enjoyed it. It was really fun. And I would love to come back again at a later date.
Okay. Well, that's the end of our Frontrunner podcast for today. Join us next time for another one in our series.